Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Ships, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. We're bringing you every week a live broadcast full of ideas about the sea and space, history and culture, all along with the expertise of Royal Museums Greenwich curators and special expert guests. This week we're also part of the BBC's Museum from Home Day. So if you're joining us from BBC Arts or you've found us that way, you're very welcome. We're here every week, so come back next week as well. If you've got a question about the topic we're talking about, or if there are topics you'd like us to deal with in future weeks, do please get in touch. You can search for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and tell us what you thought about the show, ask us questions for the future and do get involved. We'd love to hear from you. Our topic this week is keeping in touch, communication at a distance. One of the really notable things about humans as a species is that we love communicating. And one of the frustrations for many people about the current situation of lockdown is that we're finding it much harder to communicate. Video calls have become a vital link for families, but obviously that's really modern technology. Humans have been isolated in various ways for centuries, and they've dealt with it in lots of really creative and interesting ways. And so to help me dig down into the topic of communication at a distance, we have two Royal Museums Greenwich curators and a polar expert. So let me introduce them to you. We have Claire Warrior, who is the Senior Exhibitions Interpretation Curator at Royal Museums Greenwich, Robert Blyth, who's the Senior Curator of World and Maritime History, and also Prem Gill, who's a conservationist and polar scientist. So let's start with a little introduction from each of you. What's your connection to this topic? Robert, perhaps we can start with you.
Oh gosh, probably trying to avoid staying in touch. I think in the past, different forms of communication have been really important or have presented certain technological barriers which human ingenuity has been able to overcome. So I think it's that sort of ingenuity side of it that really interests me.
And Claire, how about you?
Well, I was one of the curatorial team on the Polar Worlds Gallery at the museum, and of all the places in the world that it can be difficult to communicate with, the polar regions are probably up there. So I'm interested in communication to those more remote and isolated parts of the world.
And Prem, how about you?
So I lead the Seals from Space project. So not only do I do fieldwork in very remote regions, I'm also trying to track animals from extremely remote places and trying to communicate them in ways people might not expect.
Fabulous. So loads of expertise here. Now we're going to start by setting the scene, and we're going to be telling one particular story as we go through this episode. And the letter we're about to hear is the start of that story. It was a letter that was written by Captain Francis Crozier, and he was in command of HMS Terror that had just left England. It was on its way to Greenland to look for the Northwest Passage. And Crozier was a very experienced mariner. He'd spent years in the Arctic and the Antarctic. They just left, they were calling at a port in Greenland, and this was a letter that he wrote home to a shipmate that he'd been on board with 20 years previously, and the letter is read by Simon Kane.
Whalefish Island, July 4th, 1845. My dear Jack, I do sincerely hope this will find you recovered from the effects of your most unfortunate accident. Often indeed have I thought of it, since knowing that it was your kindness in executing my commissions led you into such a trap. There is no excuse for them at the ship, in that I have no patience with such carelessness. Well, old boy, we were a long time getting clear of the coast of England and Orkneys. Our passage across was very boisterous. However, we're safely moored here and busy clearing the transport. How full we shall be! But I'm still in hopes we shall be able to stuff into her 3 years' provisions from the present time. Bergs are numerous this year, but we did not stand far enough to the west to make the packed ice on our passage up Davis Straits. Well, Jack, I wonder when we shall again meet. Some years, no doubt. This season will have a good deal to do with our future operations. If we can only make a good hit at the first, it will be most glorious. All going on as well as I could wish. Everyone has fallen very speedily into their places, and things are progressing quietly. My time, I find, is fully occupied with observations of various kinds, which I have not as yet instructed our youths in, although they are full of zeal and anxiety to do well. Living alone is the great drawback to me, but I know well it cannot be otherwise. I belong to the gregarious tribe of animals, I believe, but I do not pine much when alone. My tea and sugar has not yet turned up. The latter is to me a great loss. However, that will be a trifle if we only make a good season's work of it. I'm sending 3 men home in transport, reducing my complement to 62 from 68, which we know is quite enough too many, I would say, still. If you see anything in newspapers about us, send one old boy to my sister's, 2 Sandford Place, Dublin. I mean, if it is so that it would give them a favourable impression as to our movements. I intend writing a line to old Bird before we leave. God bless you, old boy, and that you may not have any bad effects from your unfortunate accident is the prayer of your loving friend, F.R.M. Crozier.
Now it's an amazing letter. I love it because it's so rich in detail, isn't it? And the thing that stuck out to me was obviously some accident had befallen the guy he was working to, and he felt a bit guilty about that. But there's all these other details about this expedition coming up. So what struck each of you about it? Claire, you suggested this one. Perhaps we could start with you.
I really like it because I think sometimes we think about expeditions and we forget all those things about daily life and those little comforts that make all the difference. And the image of this ship stuffed with provisions, because they know they're going for a long time. They know that there's going to be at least 3 years where they're not going to be in communication, really. So squeezing everything in and getting that last letter out was really important.
Prem, what struck you about it?
For me, also, it's the daily life and the provisions which make your life comfortable. When I was recently in Antarctica, what I noticed there was just the amount of provisions we had to allow people to feel connected back home through an emotional level. So there's endless supplies of dairy milk chocolate, and because we have a lot of builders down there from Scotland, there's also large supplies of iron brew. So it really reflects that you can tell by the provisions who's on board essentially at the base at any given time.
And Robert, how about you?
I rather like how sort of relentlessly upbeat the letter is, and he's really understating things, like describing the passage as boisterous, which probably meant it was absolutely hellish, but he's just decided to use the word boisterous. That will do for his friend.
And he was a bit miserable at the time, actually. He just proposed marriage to Franklin's niece, and she turned him down. So in other letters, he talks a little bit about how sad he's feeling and how miserable. So it's quite nice that we have a moment of something that feels a little bit more cheerful.
So he's all optimistic at the start of this great expedition to finally conquer the Northwest Passage. And we're going to come back to that story, but we're going to start somewhere else. And Robert has our first object. And I was quite excited to find that the museum had a mailboat in it. But then I saw what it was. Robert, would you tell us about this?
Right. Well, it's not a mailboat as you might imagine. It's not actually going to take any passengers. Essentially, all this is an inflated sheep's bladder connected to a small wooden box. And the idea is that the distant inhabitants of St Kilda, which is some 40 miles off the far west of the Outer Hebrides, out in the Atlantic, had very little communication with the shore, and especially in winter weather, they might be isolated for months at a time. So what they would do is pop their message, a letter, into the little box, probably wrapped in something watertight, maybe with a few coins. And when it pitched up on shore, because the prevailing current would take it across to the west coast of Scotland, someone would pocket the coins and post the letters on. And most letters were posted.
And how many years? Was this a standard system for decades, or was it just something people tried once or twice?
No, they were certainly doing it regularly from the 1890s until really almost till the island was abandoned in 1930. But there's a high degree of chance. You don't actually know where your little mailboat is actually going to pitch up. I mean, it might get stuck between 2 rocks and is never found. Or if the wind changes direction, it might end up in Norway, or in some cases, even Greenland, going in the opposite direction.
Do we know anything about how many of the letters actually reached their end destination? Did they have to sort of put in 4 just in the hope that one of them would get there?
Well, most got through. About maybe 6 in every 7 seems to have
That's pretty
made
good.
it, which is
I'm
actually
impressed.
not bad.
And what was it that finally brought this method to it? Was it a great, what were the people living on St Kilda like? Did they need to communicate? What sorts of things, what sort of letters would they need to send via this method?
Well, it might be asking for something to be sent to the island, because there was a proper mail boat that would get there, but it's just the chance of getting some message through in the winter months when accessibility is difficult. I mean, the residents of St Kilda didn't have regular communication until the outbreak of the First World War, when the Royal Navy set up a signal station on the island, which meant that radio messages could get through.
And what happened? Because it wasn't, I mean, the First World War disrupted a lot of things, but St Kilda's communication didn't last very long, did it?
Well, it didn't actually see out the end of the war. Almost unbelievably, in May 1918, a German U-boat surfaced off St Kilda and began taking pot shots at the shore and destroyed the signal station. It seems really one of the most remote areas to have the First World War to affect. And all it did essentially was damage a few buildings. It frightened all the cattle, which galloped over to the other side of the island. And I'm afraid a poor lamb was killed as a result of the bombardment of St Kilda.
So there was no more lamb and no more communications. And was this a standard? Did other islands use this method, or was this something that St Kilda was really distinctive for?
It's, I think, particularly St Kilda, because it is that extreme isolation. St Kilda is not simply remote, it's also very difficult for a boat to land there as well. It's got particularly steep sea cliffs. So in rough weather, there isn't really a safe landing ground. So why not? The current prevails to take you to the west coast of Scotland. So take
Give it a
chance.
go. Yeah. And I mean, it's the communication, because communication happens for lots of reasons. It sounds like most of this was exchanging knowledge, requests, sort of important things that you had to communicate about. But we know today that there's plenty of things that we communicate about that might not be considered essential, but are really important for human life. And those come, the social connections, keeping in touch with people, all that kind of thing. And there are some things, especially in these days of social media, that are just too much fun not to share. The whole fun of them is getting to share it with something else, and that is a special thing. Now, Prem, you've got something which is one of those things that is just too good not to share. Would you share it with us?
Sure.
Tell us about this.
Okay, so what you're looking at there is the world's rarest seal. This is the Mediterranean monk seal, and they used to be found along the beaches of the Mediterranean in large numbers. However, through persecution and loss of their habitat for reasons you can see in the video, their population plummeted and they began hiding away in these secluded coastal caves. So I thought to myself, the chances of actually encountering one when I was looking for one would be extremely hard. But I went for a walk on a beach, and there it was, surrounded by tourists eating kebabs and swinging beer. And really, from that's where my interest in monitoring seals came about. And then I thought to myself, well, how hard would it be to monitor the most common seal, if that's how easy it is to monitor the world's rarest seal? And it turns out the world's most common seals are the Antarctic seals, and they have the largest population size of one of the largest population size of any large mammal groups. And some estimates put the crab-eater seal, which is one of the Antarctic seals, as being the most numerous large mammal other than humans. But
so how many is that? What sort of numbers are we talking about?
Well, the published numbers really vary because these species live within the Antarctic pack ice zone. And really, a lot of these estimates were based on traditional forms of monitoring and communication, which is just going out in a ship and having a look. They can be, the published estimates have ranged between 2 million up to 80 million.
So your job is to monitor these seals. So you've got 2 to 8 million seals somewhere in the Antarctic, which is, hard to get to. Mm-hmm. How do you go about doing that?
Well, the way I go about doing that is actually using very high resolution satellite imagery.
For granted, the idea that, in some places like this, you have photos that are so detailed. It still astonishes me. So why is it, it is possible to get to Antarctica? What can you learn about a seal using satellite images and this very modern communication technology that you can't learn from actually being there on the ground?
So on the ground, it's very expensive, it can be quite dangerous, and the seals living in the Antarctic pack ice zone, when that sea ice zone is at its maximum extent, it covers an area that's roughly double the size of Europe. So even using planes and so on, it's not feasible to map that whole area. But with the introduction of high resolution imaging satellites, it's really changed the field. And not only can we get a global view of seals, but also other polar wildlife, and it's really revolutionized the field of wildlife monitoring. For example, using these satellites to study emperor penguins, we can see their poo from space, and just using their poo alone, it doubled the estimates for emperor penguins.
It's amazing. There is some amazing science around penguin poo, which I will leave watchers of this episode to go and look up, but it's astonishingly useful. Poo in general, very important in the world. Penguin poo, particularly useful. And I guess the thing about these photo images is that effectively you can cover such a large area. You can see seals that might never, you might never see in any other way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I spend, because the images cover such a large extent, I can spend hours and hours and hours going through images of sea ice, and occasionally I won't find a seal, and it's probably one of the most soul-destroying things about my research, but there are moments where I will encounter that scene you've seen there, where there is a seal that's just given birth, and I realise that I could be perhaps the only person that's ever seen this scene, and it gives you that personal bond and almost a personal connection to these Antarctic species, which you wouldn't have any other way.
And just give us a flavour of how important satellites are for studying Antarctica. As you said, it's difficult and expensive to go there, although it is still important to do it. But it's not just visual satellites. Mm-hmm. It's not just taking photographs. There's lots of other data that we get from satellites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole range of data. The most important for my work is also just being able to analyse the sea ice and see what's going on with there. And the seals I study within the Antarctic Peninsula and the subantarctic islands, they're within regions where you're seeing this dramatic reduction in sea ice. And for seals which rely on the sea ice for breeding and resting and foraging, being able to combine all these different data sets, whether it's sea ice, whether it's the environmental parameters to do with chlorophyll and production, as well as seeing the actual seals themselves, you can begin to get an idea of what habitat is important to the seals. And if you look in the Arctic, for example, we know there are certain types of sea ice walrus are quite preferential too, so you begin to get an idea of how will this species be able to respond to climate change and how sensitive is it to it. And you can do all of this from your own bedroom using a laptop.
It is astonishing. The communication networks we have in place today are absolutely staggering when you really look at them. And it's so easy to take it for granted. We're going to take a step back in time now, because one of the things I think that, we do have a world which has watched Earth observation satellites, have been watching the Earth for 30 or 40 years. But before that, people couldn't watch the planet. They didn't know what was going on. And so we're going to go back to the story of Crozier and Erebus and Terra, and back to a time when maybe you didn't find out, maybe there was no way to find out, there was no information. Now, after that letter we heard at the start from Crozier, there were no further written records from those ships. They disappeared, they weren't heard from again. And then 14 years later, in 1859, underneath a stone cairn in the area they were known to have gone to, something written was found. And we're going to hear a reading of it now by Simon Kane.
28th of May, 1847. HMS Erebus and Terra wintered in the ice in latitude 70 degrees 5 minutes north, longitude 98 degrees 23 minutes west, having wintered in 1846-7 at Beechey Island in latitude 74 degrees 43 minutes 28 seconds north, longitude 91 degrees 39 minutes 15 seconds west, after having ascended Wellington Channel to latitude 77 degrees and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well. Party consisting of 2 officers and 6 men left the ships on Monday the 24th of May, 1847. Signed, Graham Gore, Lieutenant, Charles F. Devoe, Mate. 25th of April, 1848. HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since the 12th of September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here, in latitude 69 degrees 37 minutes 42 seconds, longitude 98 degrees 41 minutes. This paper was found by Lieutenant Irving under the cairn supposed to have been built by Sir James Ross in 1831, 4 miles to the northward, where it had been deposited by the late Commander Gore in May-June 1847. Sir James Ross Pillar has not, however, been found, and the paper has been transferred to this position, which is that in which Sir J. Ross's pillar was erected. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Signed, F.R.M. Crozier, Captain and Senior Officer, and start on tomorrow, 26th, for Back's Fish River. Signed, James Fitzjames, Captain HMS Erebus.
Claire, this is such a dramatic piece of information. Tell us why it's split in 2 halves and what we know now about what had happened to cause them to leave this.
So the first part of the note is the bit that goes up to where it says, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. And that's really just an update. You can see that the message is written on a pre-printed form. That was pretty standard practice for an expedition like this, to take loads and loads of those forms. They would write messages about where they'd got up to, and then either leave them in a metal tube in a cairn, a small kind of monument built of stones, or they would sometimes put them into the tubes and then cast them overboard, so that it was a way of getting information back, in some ways not that dissimilar to the St Kilda mailboat, that you would hope that some of that information would eventually be found by somebody and would be useful. The second part of the message is really the kind of important bit, because it is the only written evidence that we have to date as to what might have happened. So we've already heard about Crozier and the men sailing off. It was an optimistic moment. There wasn't that much more of the Northwest Passage to explore. And the expedition was really well equipped, so they're pretty confident. But what we know is that things had started to go wrong. The fact that Franklin hadn't actually signed that first note is an indication that there's something wrong. The second part tells us that they've essentially been caught in the ice for much, much longer than they would have predicted. They would have expected to overwinter, being caught in the ice. They'd find a safe harbour, then they'd move on. But that just didn't happen. And where they get stuck is a really, really kind of isolated part of the Arctic. And they get to a point where they have no option but to abandon the ships. And from that point onwards, all we really know is that we have traces of the expedition in Nunavut, northern Canada. And we do also have the testimony of Inuit who had been interviewed, who told a lot of what happened to the expedition, apart from that piece of paper. But
So
at the time,
so was this a standard method of communication when ships were going on these expeditions? Did they have a standard procedure for writing home effectively?
yeah, so they would make the most of any kind of other ships that they came across to send things like letters home. So the letters that we have from Disco Bay and Whalefish Islands from that expedition are because they come back with whalers and with the transport ships that are coming back. So they would use the kind of infrastructure that's there of other ships. And apart from that, they would leave things like this message, like I said, casting it overboard when as often as they needed to. They would do it quite frequently. They took lots of them. I mean, they take kind of stacks of these sheets to fill in and give information about where they are, because in a way that's what is partly important, because you're talking about a time of scientific and geographic exploration where it's important that other people know what you have been mapping and charting, because that information is no good unless it comes back home.
And it's very striking in that letter that they talk about these cairns, that they're clearly known places where they're set up, these piles of stones that we call cairns. They're set up so someone else can find them. There's a sort of standard procedure for making deposits along the way that other people go back to. I mean, they knew it was John Ross's previous cairn that should be there somewhere.
Yeah, and they still exist in the Arctic today, some of the cairns from that region. You can go and see some of the ones from the search expeditions looking from Franklin. And they also draw on some of the ideas that Inuit have of these structures called inukshuk, which are ways of marking the landscape. They are ways of kind of showing people the way. And in a way, the cairns and the inukshuk function in a similar way sometimes, that they're both about showing people that there's something here that is worth knowing.
That it's fascinating, and it's amazing that it worked. So this is Ship, Sea and the Stars, the weekly online broadcast from Royal Museums Greenwich. This week we're talking about keeping in touch and communication at a distance with curators Claire Warrior and Robert Blyth and polar expert Prem Gill. Now we're going to move on to another method of communication, and Robert, this one is one of yours, and it's this. I love this. I love it's sort of it's creative, but it's very functional at the same time. Tell us about the shutter telegraph.
Right, so the shutter telegraph, it's an optical telegraph. So you'll have a series of telegraph stations, usually on the tops of hills. And this shutter telegraph begins at the Admiralty in Whitehall, and it sends its messages by moving the shutters like this. So when all of the shutters are open, the station is idle. When they're all closed, the station is about to send a message. And then through a simple moving of the shutters, you can send a series of letters and numerics down the system of telegraph stations.
And what sort of information did the Admiralty want to send?
Right, so the Admiralty might be issuing instructions to a fleet commander, telling him it's time to set sail, and then telling him you're going to sail north. So the letter M would be sent for north, and bizarrely the letter N is sent to sail east. Never mind, that was the system, and they had the code book. And the system is surprisingly effective. It can take a man on a horse 4.5, 5 hours to get from London to Portsmouth, but the shutter telegraph could get its message there in about 7.5 minutes.
So that is astonishing. So this is London to Portsmouth, and which year was this? Remind me.
So this is in the 1790s.
So that is an astonishing speed. It sounds as though the people who did the moving of the shutters, that they must have been the equivalent of Google coders today. Is that a highly skilled task? Are they valued for it, or is that just mundane labor?
No, there'll be an officer in charge of the station, and then a team making these very rapid adjustments of the shutters, and that message that's arriving in 7.5 minutes is in theory traveling at about 640 miles an hour. So it's faster than a commercial jetliner is traveling at its cruising speed.
I'm not sure there'd be much call for setting it up again. And did other people pick up on this? Was it just an Admiralty thing that they did for a short period, or did it carry on, and did other people start to pick up on this idea?
Well, the idea actually came from France, where it was beginning to be trialled, and the British essentially thought that they had better keep up. So the system with the shutters was invented by a clergyman, the Reverend Murray, and it's very good, but is actually quite slow, even though it can get the message there in 7.5 minutes. And other methods were introduced, including one with arms that moved more like a modern semaphore system, and that proved very much faster. So messages get beyond the speed of sound, in theory, in the early 19th century.
And did people need to send quick messages? I mean, we think today, we know that the electric telegraph, for example, you could use it, you know, trains could suddenly run on time because it was instant, and you could coordinate things that did need to be known to within a few minutes. But back in the late 1700s, did it matter whether it happened now or in 10 minutes time or in a few hours time? Did they really need to know that did they need this information that quickly?
Well, there are two things, of course. The telegram can send messages, obviously, in both directions. So if the French invasion fleet is suddenly seen off the south coast of England, then the last thing you want is a horse plodding its way to London to telling you that the French have just landed. So getting that message back in minutes is really important. The other thing is that you are more guaranteed that the message will get through. You don't know what's going to happen to your lone horseman and rider, on horseback. And well, highwaymen, an accident, all these sorts of things can be avoided by the shutter telegraph. But even the shutter telegraph has its problems. It's useless in fog or cloudy weather, and you can't use it at night. So all the French needed to do in reality was either land on a foggy day or land in the middle of the night, and the shutter telegraph wouldn't have helped them either way.
So still, but what it's talking about this concept of communication networks. That's what's interesting here, is because it's to have a message that has to go, you know, along one track is one thing, but when it gets really interesting, I think, is when it broadens out, and it's like the letters, you get this relaying effect where it goes from one station to another station to another station. Did they have a way of routing these things, or was it just there was a beginning and an end, and that's the only route you could take?
No, they could route them. So individual dockyards had individual codes. So if you wanted to send a message to Deal, you would signal the letter E. If you wanted to send it to Portsmouth, you could signal F. And if you wanted to send it to everybody, you had a separate code for that as well. I mean, the key thing with it was to keep the messages as short and simple as possible. And the more complex they become, the greater the danger of getting a garbled message and then having to send back and ask for the message to be repeated again. So it could then just come to a juddering halt.
And I guess there's a limit to the number of addresses you can have if the code for a place is just one letter. You have a bandwidth limit.
So essentially, they're really only being used for Admiralty communications. So it's not as if they're, Mrs. Jones is trying to get in touch with her husband. It's not being used for that. It's really only being used for official communication. But, for example, the telegraph to Liverpool then begins to be used for commercial purposes as well, when ships are going to be sailing and things like that. So it does get adapted, but it's principally best for official communication.
And we're moving, later on, well, sometime later, I guess maybe a century later, we move into not just networks, but the idea of sending out messages where you don't know who's listening. And so these telegraphs, you had to have a post, you had to be listening out for that message. But as time went on, people started to develop ways to communicate, to send out a message without knowing it's going to be received. Now, we're going to pick up on the story of Franklin again. And Claire, tell us about the balloon.
So in the collections at the museum, we have a rather spectacular balloon made from paper in a silk net, and then stained, we think, probably with something like blackberries, I think our conservation staff worked out. And this balloon was used to try and find out what had happened to the expedition. So over the time, after about 3 years, when they haven't heard anything back at home in England, a whole raft of search expeditions get sent out. And initially they are planning to search for survivors. So they take things like this balloon, which is filled with hydrogen on board the ship, and then it has a slow burning fuse that drops messages across the Arctic landscape. So they're printed either on paper or on silk, and they hopefully tell the crew members that there are people looking for them, sometimes where there are food to be found, and just kind of are there to to get that communication across as wide a distance as possible. They had hoped that the messages would be strewn over some hundreds of miles, but in fact the furthest one they found was about 50 miles away from the ship that the balloon left from. But this isn't the only kind of method that they use. It's difficult because it's a vast area and it's not really well known to the searching expeditions. It's known to local people, but not so much in depth for the people that are looking for Franklin and his men. So they use things like the balloon, but they use things like collars that they put on Arctic foxes with similar kinds of messages, catch the foxes, let them go, hope they're going to find Franklin and his men. They have special buttons that are engraved with similar messages that they pass to local Inuits and then hope those will go through trading networks and maybe find Franklin and his men.
And I mean, I guess by the time, we know now that by the time this was sent out, none of Franklin's men were left, but lots of other people must have found them. How many have been found of these things?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, actually. We know that the messages were kind of strewn across the landscape, but we don't get much record of what happens to them. The foxes, we don't report any success from the Arctic Fox mission either, other than that there is one of the collars in the Polar Museum in Cambridge. So really, in terms of kind of successful messaging, it's just one of any number of communication methods, but they're not necessarily very useful.
And this must have been a fantastically expensive thing. I mean, I suppose the ships that took the balloons and the collars, they probably sent, men off the side, they probably sent people out to look and to ask questions and things. But there's a lot of money involved here. Who's paying for all of this?
Well, some of it is the Admiralty, but Franklin's wife, Jane, actually is one of the really important characters in this, in that she is the voice that is constantly asking for expeditions to be sent out. And she also uses money herself, some of which was really to go to Franklin's daughter. It's the money that Franklin had left behind. So once she knows that the Admiralty declare the men dead, she is able to use the money that Franklin leaves just to try and find out what's happened. It's not then about finding him alive, but it's just having some kind of a closure to the story. And she bankrolls this to a huge extent, falls out with her family over the whole thing. So she's very important in that story.
And she spends years on this mission, right? She really is completely committed to not letting anything get in her way.
Yeah, it's decades, really. I mean, it's right the way through. Although this message is found in the 1850s, in 1859, on one of the expeditions that she had funded on the yacht, the Fox. The expeditions go right the way through to the 1870s. She involves the Americans in the expeditions. She goes all over the world, kind of trying to raise support for trying to find out what had happened.
So it's a sad end to the story, but it's all told in terms of these sort of glimpses, the letters and the messages are these tiny little windows. And in the world we live in now, where there's just information everywhere, it almost seems impossible that information could be scarce. And yet this was a time in which there was almost no information, right? There were newspapers, but you were really drip fed what was going on in the world around you.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the things that we have in the museum's collection are fragments. They're the bits, the detritus of the expedition that the men who leave the ships take with them, that's then kind of dropped on the Arctic landscape on King William Island in Nunavut, and then is retrieved and comes back home. It's only in the 2010s, in 2014 and 2016, that we get anything more substantial, and that's the discovery of the two wrecks by archaeologists from Parks Canada. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror are found using side scanning sonar technology. I don't really know how that works, but you can see the picture of HMS Erebus on the internet. You can see the form of the ship that they have found and that they're now excavating to hopefully get some more of those answers.
And there's such dramatic sonar images. I mean, it's 160, 170 years later. And what you see on site, so side scan sonar is sound being sent down. It's a bit like echolocation for a bat. You send out pings and it allows you to build up this picture. And you see they're almost like shadows emerging from the seafloor. And they're such dramatic images, especially when you know the story of these ships. It's astonishing that, there's still those surprises in modern life. And again, that's a communication thing, that the sound is allowing us to probe the ocean in a way that a human really couldn't. So we're going to move on to our final exhibit. And of course, these days, polar explorers generally come home, which is a good thing. But then they bring things back with them. And Prem, you have some recordings of seal sounds that you've brought back with you. Tell us about these.
So I was listening to the sounds of Antarctic seals after I heard of some people who'd been working out in Antarctica during the winter. And when they go out onto the sea ice, they would say, you know, a nice reminder that you're not all alone would be hearing these noises from these breeding Antarctic seals. And it was also a good reminder that actually you're not on a stable bit of land, you're just on a thin piece of sea ice out in the open ocean. But essentially, I started listening to these noises, and I think what might be best is if I give you a little demo of some of the noises. Mm-hmm. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play some other noises, which is from our Halley base in Antarctica, which is recorded from our low frequency radio, and they're what we call space noises from our space weather base. So I'm going to play one or two of these noises, and I want you to try and guess which is which as part of a little pop quiz. So this is the first noise. What are we guessing? Seal? Space?
Seal.
Seal.
Yeah, go on.
Baby Weddell seal. I'm going to go swiftly on to the next noise.
Oh, I think that's a radio crackle.
So
what's everyone else thinking?
Space.
Okay, yes.
Hey.
That is, so that's picked up at our Halley base using our low frequency radio receiver. And that's essentially the radio waves emitted by geomagnetic storms, which is linked also to the generation of auroras. Another sound. What are we thinking?
That's a good noise. That's
I don't know.
Whatever it is.
A good noise.
Bad
I'm going to need an
indigestion, I
answer,
think.
I'm afraid. What are the bets?
50-50.
I just said
50-50.
I was an underwater mammal making noises underwater, actually, but so I'm going to guess space.
Seal.
Seal.
Ah,
What's a
copped out.
seal doing when it makes that noise?
I'm not entirely sure, but it's mainly during the breeding season, so that's when they really begin to vocalize. And you have, during this period, this is a Weddell seal, and you basically have competition for female Weddells who are out on top of the sea ice, but the males are actually underwater protecting the breathing holes to the females. And what happens is once the female has weaned her pup, the male would come out of the breathing hole to mate. So it's really just ways of communicating during that period while the male is in the water protecting access to the female.
And go on.
Oh no.
Do you use the sounds to help you study the seals, or do you just record them because they're interesting?
So to begin with, these noises were just used as a little pop quiz to make sure people were listening to my lecture at the start. But after one of the lectures I gave, someone came up to me from the Alan Turing Institute saying, "Hey, I make a techno music on the side, should we do a song?" And I grew up on grime music, and some of the noises these Antarctic seals have always reminded me of grime. So I thought to myself, why not use this as a way of communicating and connecting with, say, young people from inner city backgrounds, to connect them to Antarctic science, to polar science, to the plight of Antarctic seals, and then use it as a way to show them all the different ways you can conduct science now and how accessible it's become, because you can just do it from your laptop using these very high resolution satellite images that I showed previously.
And I guess it's a different kind of messaging, isn't it? We've been talking about messages as having very direct information, you know, here are some words and I'm going to send these words to you. And what you're talking about is communication in a different way, something that's a bit more subtle, but it's a message that says you're connected to this, and that matters as well.
Yeah, it's very much, for me, a big motivation about this is communicating and connecting people and showing them that your instant thought of Antarctica of being a remote place, all these images of these sepia-toned, rugged explorers, is not necessarily the case, and you too can be a polar explorer if you wish.
And what kind of response do you get to this sort of music? Do kids pick up on it?
Yeah, no, they all love it. And then of course I get to show them the satellite imagery as well. And I had a week in December. For a week, I invited students from underrepresented backgrounds to come join me at the British Antarctic Survey, where we were going through satellite images and just hearing their sort of shrieks of excitement when they would come across a colony of seals, knowing no one else has ever seen that seal. It's just that personal connection, which really, really helps build a bond to a place that a lot of people see in the media as very remote and hostile and something which is not connected to our everyday lives.
But the availability of this, satellite data and satellite communication means that you can discover things. Even, if you've got a good internet connection, you can discover these things as well.
If anyone's watching this and they want to go find a brand new penguin colony, you just have to go online, look for Landsat or Sentinel-2 imagery, which is freely available. Look around Antarctica, because people do find undiscovered penguin colonies, and you can as well.
And I think there might be a Galaxy Zoo project on this as well, on the penguins. I'm not quite sure, but if you are interested, there's this wonderful website called Galaxy Zoo where you can help looking through data for this sort of thing. And I'm pretty sure there's one on penguins. So yes, do go and have a look for that. Right, we are almost out of time. There's so much to talk about and we have run out of time as always. We had one question from Twitter, which I am just going to put to our curators, which is, did people really put messages in bottles?
Yes, they did.
In tubes.
And tubes.
And tubes, yeah.
Round things.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, the St Kilda mail boat is just an oddly shaped bottle. It's the same principle.
So there've been lots of people messaging through history, through just good luck. Write your message in a bottle, throw it overboard, and hope it turns up somewhere. So never give up hope. That's what all of that says. Because all the ones we've got back were found by someone. We don't know how many have not been found by anyone. So keep up the creativity with the messaging. And that is the thing that strikes me about everything we've talked about today, is there are so many ways that people have tried to communicate. Communication is so important to us, and people will try anything, think of these wonderful ideas to get messages through. It really does matter. So we have come to the end of this episode. Thank you very much if you've been watching. We'll be back every week with more museum objects, more expertise from our curators and special guests. If there's a question that is burning away in your mind and you really want an answer to it, or a topic you'd like us to cover, there are loads of things at Royal Museums Greenwich. The collections are astonishing. We can dig into all kinds of topics. So if you've got an idea, look for us on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. So just look for Royal Museums Greenwich and you'll find us. Send us a message. We'd love to hear from you. The museum may be closed, but if you go to the Royal Museums Greenwich website, there are all sorts of things going on. Just as one example, the Maritime Museum is hosting online drawing classes every Wednesday at the moment. And you can get there if you go to rmg.co.uk/online drawing. So go and have a look for that. Next week, we're going to be talking about the escape to the coast and our relationship with the coast, what's beyond it, what's on this side of it. We'll have more fabulous objects from the museum to talk about that. We're going to finish by playing out on what Prem calls the Grime Seal song. But just before we get to that, I would like to thank our three fabulous contributors, Claire Warrior, Robert Blythe and Prem Gill. Thank you very much to Simon Kane for the readings. Huge thank you to Steve Thompson, who has composed the music that is going to be our theme tune from now on. He's called it Nanny's Theme, after the figurehead of Cutty Sark. James Gill was the producer. I'm Helen Czerski. See you next week.